Camilla, we are back in the studio today. It was so lovely being with you yesterday at the ARC conference. You were amongst your people. You were bright, you were on your toes, you were enjoying every conversation as the righties got together and laid out their policies for the future. But today, back to earth with a bump. Inflation is up. Labour's policies are causing real problems, and Rachel Reeves has got a whole lot of work to do if she is going to convince anyone that she can be trusted with the UK economy.
Yes, indeed. So back on Planet Labour, we've got the Chancellor's decision to slap VAT on school fees, to increase the minimum wage and to add 25 billion to national insurance contributions, all being blamed for today's high inflation figure of 3%. It isn't coming down. Neither are our mortgage rates, Kamal. It's a disaster, isn't it, this? We should be discussing it.
We will, and we'll also be discussing how truthful is Labour more generally. After Rachel Reeves' small snafus with her CV, now the business secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, is accused of exaggerating his CV. Was he actually a solicitor? Well, as you said, Camilla, hopes of an interest rate cut in May look like they've been dashed. Inflation is up. Household bills are up. Price of food is up. I think chancellors always have to be wary of two numbers which are published every month. First is the GDP number, economic growth. That has been flatlining since the last election and actually well before that as well. And the other number is inflation. People really notice when their prices are going up. And as the Democrats found in America, if at the end of your time in office, inflation is higher than when you started, you will always have a problem. So Rachel Reeves had poor GDP figures last week and a inflation number today, which has surprised a lot of economists because it is so high.
Also, I know we're not in recession and I'm not trying to scaremonger unnecessarily, but if you do look at GDP per head, and I know you like doing that, we could be classed as being in a GDP per head recession if we wanted to. And I think I personally felt that the budget was economically illiterate. And I know we disagree slightly on this VAT on private school fees, probably because, disclaimer, I take it more personally because 2 out of my 3 children are at private schools. Had to absorb the cost of that, and that's fine. But I do find it self-defeating if a policy that was aimed at a minority is now affecting the majority because everyone's having to contend with an increase in inflation. Second of all, the national insurance contribution issue. We know, because there was a report, I think last week, several reports suggesting that business foreclosures are now at a 20-year high, that small and medium-sized businesses, you and I have discussed it, are really struggling. Been covering it on the podcast, covering it on my GB News show, spoke to 2 chaps in hospitality last week saying, literally, with alcohol duty and now this on the wage bill, it's signalling the death knell for pubs. And I think that's really dangerous. And I think if you've got a situation where there isn't confidence among the business community in the Treasury and in the Chancellor, then that's very difficult. And I also think that the cost of net zero is coming home to roost. We spoke yesterday about sort of the pendulum swinging back when it comes to issues of sort of a culture war description, transgender issues around freedom of speech, this idea that if you don't agree with me, then you should be cancelled. It's not the same, by the way, to be a climate skeptic, to say that you are worried about net zero and its impact on actual taxpayers and particularly elderly people. There is this thing now that we do know that the elderly are not putting their heating on. I don't know about you, but I returned home last night and my house was freezing. And another friend of mine who actually does mortgage deals for people and things actually messaged the kind of girly group that I'm on last week and said, if I were you, I'd fix in your energy price now because of everything going on in Ukraine and with Russia, prices could go up again. Got a missive from my own supplier saying, you better fix in. You know, nothing's going in the right direction for the Labour government or indeed the electorate, Kamal.
That small business thing is really important. We often forget that small businesses drive a huge amount of our economy. We're often too focused on the big businesses. Of course, they're very important, but it's the small businesses that are the backbone. A friend of mine, Alison Wedgwood of the Wedgwoods, famous Stoke potters. She lives near Stoke-on-Trent. She rang me this morning to talk about another small pottery firm there called Royal Stafford that has just announced it's going to go into receivership, particularly around very high energy bills. And of course, things like national insurance are that sort of last straw that breaks the camel's back for many businesses when you're talking about very, very small margins. You spoke about pubs. Let's hear from Tim Martin. He's the founder and chairman of Weatherspoons. He spoke to Sky News about these inflation figures that we've had today and said that Reeves's tax raid would mean an extra 1.2 million in costs for his pub chain. That's not every year, Camilla. That's not every month, Camilla. That's every week.
What?
Where I think modern politicians across the parties are at fault is they don't understand and have a natural feel for the importance of free enterprise. The reason North America is much stronger than South America, or South Korea is much stronger than North Korea economically, is because of free enterprise. And for 40 years, politicians in my career understood that. I think the last 10 years or so, they've forgotten and thought really business is a milch cow run by people who only care about themselves. So it's quite a difference in the perception of businesses, whereas we're here in Harrogate. We want people in Harrogate, young people, old people, to start their own businesses, employ a few people, earn a bit of tax for the economy.
Does that mean kind of, disappointment with Labour? Labour came in saying we're going to be very pro-business. Does this feel like a pro-business government to you?
I think they understand they have to be pro-business. They were a little bit arrogant to start with, and they realise now that some of the moves they've made have got counterintuitive consequences. You put taxes up a lot, you got inflation and so on. So I think they're learning on the job.
That was Sir Tim Martin, boss of Weatherspoons, speaking to Sky's Darren McCaffrey. Let's just go through. I don't want to blind with numbers, but in fact, do you know what? My test on inflation is the Haribo test. I don't mind telling you this, Kamal, because I am functionally enumerate. This is the way I understand it. Back in the day, not that long ago, Haribos were £1. They're now anything between £1.25 and £1.35, which would suggest to me a food inflation rate of 25 or 35%. So even the actual inflation rate itself, I don't think accurately reflects prices in the supermarkets at least. But to look at the actual data, the price of food and drink has climbed 3.3% in the past year, driven by meat, bread, cereals and fish. You're obsessed with the price of eggs. Not just in the US, but here.
But for good reason. Similar to your Haribo's test, it's what people can connect.
Yes.
If you talk about inflation, it's difficult to connect to your real world. One of the biggest staples we buy every day are eggs. And as J.D. Vance said in America, vote Trump, get cheaper eggs. If that is not true, that is bad for politics.
OK, so the average price of a dozen eggs now, do you want to take a guess?
£3.
£3.45, which is 4% higher than a year ago. You've also got the situation where food prices, of course, are driven up because of natural disasters, but also Ukraine, once known as the breadbasket of Europe.
Let's look at service prices. Those are the restaurants we go to, the hotels we stay at, flying abroad, hair salons we use, all the things that you've got the basics, haven't you, which is food, your energy costs, your mortgage, but the service sector is the things that you enjoy, the things that are extra to, how you go about your day-to-day life. And they've gone up by 5%, and the service part of our economy is a very significant driver of higher inflation. Because at 5%, they're above the 3% figure for inflation we had today. That shows the direction of travel for inflation into the future. And there are now some economists saying that inflation could rise to close to 4% over 2025.
And the other warning that we've had from the Office for National Statistics is that the increase in the minimum wage will be a factor in pushing up service prices going forward. And my dad always used to say this when it came to staff at his nursing home. you can increase the minimum wage, but that means that everybody else has to also get a bump so that there is a differential between those on the lowest wages and those on the highest. So the idea that the increase in the minimum wage just means you put one level of staff costs up is for the birds, as you all know, as somebody who's run his own business as well as being a business and economics expert. And then let's talk about net zero.
Net zero, I think, Keir Starmer, as I've said in my column, I've written a few times, and I think that Donald Trump gives him some cover. He has got to move away from the ridiculous targets he has set because they're not being set by the market. We will eventually get to a situation where cleaner energy has more of a role in our lives, but the state has got to remove itself and let the market get us there in a gentler way. As soon as you have the state involved in markets, the markets start sending out different signals. Researching just before we came onto the podcast, we still have an energy price cap, which was a reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the huge spike in energy prices because Europe had relied so much on Russian energy for its own fuel. That price cap, put in place by a Conservative government, one of the things that Liz Truss felt she had to support, one of the reasons that her budget was so controversial was because she put up the energy price cap just before that budget, the energy price subsidy, just before that budget. So it's the Conservatives as well as Labour. Of course, it was Theresa May and Rishi Sunak who set the net zero targets. It was Ed Miliband and Keir Starmer who then doubled down on those targets. They simply aren't working. And we now have the most expensive energy in Europe. We weren't in that position 3 or 4 years ago. And there's an honesty issue here as well for Keir Starmer. I just looked through the manifesto before the last election. Labour's manifesto changed on the front page. There's
Power
Keir
stance,
Starmer.
yep.
There's Keir Starmer with his shirt and tie looking like he's ready for business. Literally, page 51, which is from the section on the energy future of the UK, families and businesses will have lower bills. A literal promise from the person who was to become Prime Minister. So I went and looked this morning on the latest data. The Commons Library, always a very good place to look for research. It's impartial, and their team there at the Commons Research do great work. It is pointing out that since the summer of 2024 and the Labour government, electricity prices and gas prices for all of us have gone up. And the judgment is, because of the amount of subsidies we are putting into our net zero targets in trying to reach net zero, that prices will go up again when the price cap is next set by Ofgem by about £100 on an annual bill. So those numbers are going to go up and up. And so there's a problem of the policy, which I think, Camilla, goes to this point of economic illiteracy. You can't buck the market by the state. It never works. And there's a problem of politics, which is you told us our bills would fall and our bills are going up.
And lo and behold, Kamal, we have a story in the Telegraph, which has been much commented on, as you would imagine, headlined, "Net zero will mean higher bills, admit Miliband's officials." And that's referring, of course, to the energy price cap going up in April. And the piece by our colleague Matt Oliver, the industry editor, points out that Miliband's officials have admitted this in a complete contradiction of the Energy Secretary's own claims. So you're right to suggest there's a credibility issue here, which seems to be unfortunate, doesn't it? Because we've had the electorate feeling terribly let down by the Conservatives, breaking manifesto pledge after manifesto pledge. And now we seem to have a sort of continuity, dishonesty government. And that brings us on nicely to Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary. I interviewed Jonathan Reynolds on my GB News show on Sunday, and I so wish that this Guido Fawkes story, which has been followed up by the Telegraph and everyone else today, had broken before I got to interview him. Because essentially, Reynolds now appears to have been caught in a lie. He has been describing himself in various different guises, both in the Commons and indeed on social media and beyond, as, quotes, a solicitor. But it has been discovered that he didn't actually qualify. He was a trainee solicitor, but he never got his full qualification. So why, Kamal, is he describing himself as a solicitor?
Now, Labour have said it was inadvertent, so let's just quote what Labour has said about Jonathan Reynolds' comments. They said it was a passing reference in a 5-minute speech. This is a passing reference to him being a solicitor rather than a trainee solicitor. This is a passing reference in a 5-minute speech where Jonathan is talking about commuting as part of a discussion on rail. It's not a discussion on his professional background. There are countless examples where he has said he was a trainee. This is a matter of public record. A source also quoted in our story said about Jonathan Reynolds that the information on the archived web page, which does talk about him being a solicitor, was written in the third person and should therefore not be attributed to Mr. Reynolds. Now, where that defence, I think, fails is that he should always have described himself as a trainee solicitor, because that is all he ever was. Now, this story, while maybe quite small in itself, it just adds to the sense that Labour and this government are loose on the facts and loose to the point of suspicion. We had the whole thing with Rachel Reeves and her CV. Initially, she said she worked at Halifax Bank of Scotland as an economist. Actually, she then updated her CV to say that she worked there in the complaints department, which led to that slightly unfair joke that she was Rachel from complaints. And then at the Bank of England, where she was an economist, she suggested that she worked there for 10 years when actually it was more like 6. So it just gives the public this sense of, when you say something, are you being very precise? For Jonathan Reynolds, the fact that he was only a trainee solicitor means that he should have just used that phraseology. So what it does for the public is, why are they fast and loose with the facts? Now, maybe it was interesting. We had a really good chat about this at our morning meeting at 10 o'clock. One of the team said, well, trainee solicitor, it's kind of, you might just say it by mistake. My point is, he's the Secretary of State for Business. He's in the cabinet. You have to be absolutely punctilious about who you are. And why are you loose with your language? If you're training to be a doctor, you don't describe yourself as a doctor. You say, I'm a medical student, or I'm training to be a doctor. You have to be really clear. And it just seems odd that Labour keep misstepping on this issue of truth. And a Labour government that said they were coming in to sweep away all that type of behaviour. They were going to be slightly holier than thou. I remember, Camilla, you and me saying in the first podcast after the general election, they have set the bar so high that every misstep becomes more important. So for them to come out and say, oh, it was inadvertent, he didn't really mean it, doesn't wash because of the standard they have set themselves.
In the Chancellor's defence, a spokesman for Rachel Reeves confirmed that dates on her LinkedIn stipulating when she worked at the Bank of England were inaccurate and said it was due to an administrative error by the team. And also the trouble for Jonathan Reynolds and his ilk is that he's obviously said this "I was a solicitor" line to try and head off at the pass accusations that he didn't have a career before politics. And this is something that's levelled on a lot of the people in the cabinet. What did you do before? Where were you? And you scratch the surface and find out that actually they were involved in student politics, then end up working for Labour councils, then ended up becoming MPs and don't have enough real life experience. Now, this is something actually that Kemi Badenoch can exploit, I think, because like or loathe the Tories, and they've made their mistakes, haven't they? And they have squandered their reputation for competence and indeed fiscal discipline, frankly. They've squandered their reputation for honouring manifesto pledges. What they can claim to be by comparison to Labour and indeed Reform is experienced. That shtick that she has going, she said it in here in the Daily Tea with us, I've learned from my mistakes. That could be a position of strength for her because there is this growing perception that the cabinet is appearing out of its depth. We've discussed Keir Starmer's, frankly, lack of political nous. The Chancellor now looks like she is having to over-exaggerate her own experience because she's struggling to maintain supremacy in office, so to speak. She's struggling actually to convince the business public that her budget was a good idea. We've now got figures like Reynolds, and people are going, are you actually up to the job? Really problematic for him. Really problematic as well for Reform to attack that, because the argument will be, all right, we know that Rupert Lowe's run his own business and owned a football club and all the rest of it, but you've never run anything, governmentally or otherwise, really. Nigel Farage, come on, spent the last 20 years just being a political disruptor. So this then begs the question of Badenoch, why isn't she cutting through on this? Conversely, she hasn't got enough experience in her own shadow cabinet. Why isn't Ian Duncan-Smith there alongside her? Why isn't David Davis? Why aren't people, real grey hairs there? She's appointed a few people that, in my mind, seem flaky at best. I mean, I'm not necessarily going to name names, but I think she could try and push at least the experience angle. We've been there, we've done it, we've got the T-shirt. She's trying to do that. It's not quite working. But this is something perhaps she could exploit in future.
I think you're right that Labour's inexperience, it goes back to Tim Martin's point at Weatherspoons, wasn't it? They don't have business experience. And also the other experience, you mentioned councillors and student politics. They often all worked in the NGO and charity sector as well. So Keir Starmer, when he's thinking about his first reshuffle, and there's been some reports that could come before summer, he's got to think, this is the moment now in the political political journey that he's on. Who do I want for the real battle ahead? Okay, the first year, if you think about Margaret Thatcher in 1979, she had a lot of what were called wets in her cabinet because she had to be a bit continuity with the Tories in opposition. Is Keir Starmer smart enough and tough enough to get rid of the underperformers? And speaking to my Labour contacts, Rachel Reeves, I think, is bulletproof at the moment. Now, it could
you
all
fire
go,
a chancellor and you're firing yourself.
Exactly. You've got real problems, and Tony Blair could never take on Gordon Brown, even though there was huge tension between the two of them. But let's put Rachel Reeves to one side because that's the Chancellor. But if he's looking through David Lammy, Ed Miliband, Jonathan Reynolds, the type of people that are most often in the public's mind, Yvette Cooper, my sources are saying, Yvette Cooper, as Home Secretary, one of the most toxic jobs in government that often is derailed by something that hits you left field you didn't expect was going to happen, is doing a job where she hasn't yet been involved in a massive controversy of her own making.
She's treading water in the English Channel right now. That's what she's doing.
People are saying, you're right, people are saying she hasn't really got a grip of immigration, but last week she had the films of the deportation flights, never been shown in the UK before in that style, right out of the Trump playbook. She's playing as hard as she can into a new sense of what this Labour government is about. I don't think it's quite believable yet, but she's playing those cards. So what is Keir Starmer going to do? I think your advice to Kemi Badenoch is excellent. I think my advice to Keir Starmer would be, who is your real professional team for those middle years of government where if you don't produce on growth and if you don't bring down inflation, you're out?
Can I add two more people? Bridget Phillipson. It's complete and utter lunacy to pick a public fight with Britain's most successful head teacher. Complete madness. Secondly, Lord Hermer, the Attorney General. He is attracting negative headline after negative headline. We've got a whole call sheet now of literally enemies of the state who he has defended in a private capacity. Completely support the idea that everyone has the right to a defence mounted by somebody like Lord Hermer, but it speaks volumes about Keir Starmer's own associations, ideologies and beliefs. And frankly, he's just attracting too much. Maybe it's convenient that he is the resident sponge. He's picking up a lot of flack.
The fire guard, yeah.
I was going to say something else. I was going to preface sponge with another word, but this is a family podcast. But I would suggest that those two also may be in the sort of headlights.
Can I tell you a little joke that's doing the rounds in Whitehall?
Go on.
Please God, don't hire another lawyer whose name ends MER.
very good point. It's not the best joke, that, is it?
No,
Whitehall joke.
I know, but it's a Whitehall joke. You've got to give them their due. It's not exactly.
I know. It's yes.
It's not exactly Saturday Live,
No,
but it's the fact. You're absolutely right. It's the fact that it connects Keir Starmer to someone who obviously funded Keir Starmer when he was in opposition and is now his lawyer mate from North London. The Camdification, so Camden, the borough of Camden, where I proudly live, as you know, Quilla, that all his Camden mates are basically in the government.
Yeah, and now I also love this idea that Starmer agrees with the senior judge who has expressed a degree of concern about the judiciary setting immigration policy. Yes, Starmer now, a man who blows in the wind, is now anti-immigration lawyers. As you say, if it was comedy, it would be Marxism but Groucho. Here are my principles, and if you don't like them, I have others. Should we be putting on fake moustaches and glasses at this stage, Kamal? Honestly.